Okay, so we are on air. It's Wrap Your Head Around podcast with me, Mr. John Hirschfield. Nice to meet you, and it's great to having you on my podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate
Thank
the
you.
invitation.
John is a director of the Center of OCD and Anxiety in the psychiatric hospital, Shepherd Pratt in Towson. Yeah, and he, like you, specialized in the OCD treatment, and you are an author of. I know this book. I use it with my patients in Poland. Here, yeah, it's a book that's been published in Poland by wydawnictwo Uniwersytetu Jagiellońskiego. So it's very good Polish publisher. And maybe on the beginning, maybe you'd say something about you, about your, the biggest interest as the OCD is.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that introduction. I've never had the privilege of visiting Poland. Ancestry.com tells me that I'm probably from there. At least my my mother's family is probably from that area originally.
Right.
So I remember when the Polish translation for the book came out, and it just came in the mail, and I opened it up, and I said, I don't know what any of this means. And I was like, oh, it's a Polish translation. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So I was very happy to see that.
Yeah.
So as you said, I direct the Center for OCD and Anxiety here at Shepherd Pratt, which is a very large mental health institution in Maryland, on the east coast of the United States. And what we have here is we have an outpatient center, and we have a residential center. The residential center is called The Retreat, and at The Retreat, adults with any number of psychiatric issues come and stay here and live here at the hospital.
Okay.
And if they have OCD, I get to meet with them and help them figure out, what kind of OCD is it, and what's the best way for us to treat it. And then I have this wonderful team of specialists that I've trained and supervised, and we all kind of work with that person to help them with their OCD, while all of the other staff help with their other issues they might come in with, depression, substance use, trauma, things like that. So it's very, very gratifying work to help people, when they're really struggling, and to see them get better.
Yeah, and I think that this is great that you have a very complex clinic, that you have like very complex treatment, that the word, but I understand that this is not like a closed word, but the people come and they stay for the treatment, and they have also the individual therapy and the group therapy. Yeah, something like
exactly
like this. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
No, and I just wanted to share the idea that this is something that we missed in Poland. Yeah, that we have the separated things, and this is, I think this is in general a great idea to have this complex approach.
Yes, and it's something that I'm still learning, because the book that you just showed in English is the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD.
Yeah.
When I was working on that book, it was I was treating OCD in an outpatient setting, and this is a book about OCD and what are the gold standard treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure and response prevention, mindfulness, and all of those things, and everything OCD. But then when you meet people who have very severe OCD for a very long time, you realize workbooks are great. I love this book. I'm so happy how many people it's helped. But people are not their diagnoses. People are complicated, right? And so if everybody could just read a book and then they were fine, then we wouldn't need, a mental health hospital, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So when I'm working with people, here at the hospital, I have to keep that in mind, that okay, we're going to do ERP, and we're going to use mindfulness, and we're going to really kind of understand the OCD. But we need to be flexible, just like you need to be flexible with your unwanted thoughts. I need to be flexible with the things that look like OCD but might not be OCD, or might not be OCD but could be treated like OCD and it could still work. And so I'm learning how to be a more flexible clinician as well, and not be so tied to everything in the workbook, even though everything in the workbook I hope, resonates with people with OCD.
Yeah. And I think that it is very important that, as you mentioned, just to be flexible and to respond to our patients' needs. Yeah. And what would be your advice for the therapies that works with patients with OCD? Yeah, um, maybe about also being flexible, or maybe it would be something else. What would be for you the most important advices for the therapist?
I think what sometimes gets lost in evidence-based care, because we do all of this research and we write all of these books and we know the treatments that work, what sometimes gets lost is the importance of the therapeutic relationship.
Okay.
So it's kind of like what I was saying before, people are not their diagnoses. And OCD in particular really requires trust in a relationship with the therapist, right? Because they're going to open up to you to tell you about thoughts and images and urges that they often feel very ashamed of, that they feel they can't talk to other people about, that are terrifying to them. And so the very first exposure anybody does is ask for help,
Talk.
right?
Yeah. Ask for help. Yeah.
So I think the first thing I when I'm training people, when I'm thinking about these concepts, is don't forget you're a therapist, you're a clinician, you're not a mechanic that comes in just to fix a piece of the car. You're a person in relation to another person.
Yeah.
And then if you can actually establish, hey, I'm listening to you, I understand what you're saying. You're telling me that you want your life to be one way, but it's another. You're telling me that you have a fear and you want to get to the other side of it, and you're engaging in these behaviors to try to do that, but these behaviors are not working for you. So we should probably try something different. Let's work together. Let's collaborate. What would be different? What haven't you done? And I say this to a lot of my patients. It's always the thing you haven't done that works, right? You've tried compulsions. Have you tried exposure? Have you tried agreeing with the thoughts? Have you tried, okay, you've tried avoidance. What happens if you don't avoid? Oh, well, I have these very scary thoughts and feelings.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what happens when you have those? How can we collaborate and say, okay, I'm going to show my brain that there's another way, that I can be a person who has these thoughts and feelings even though I don't like them, and I can relate to them in a different way so that they're not the reason why I'm suffering, right?
Okay.
Everybody suffers in one way or another, but if you're suffering because you have unwanted thoughts, that is a solvable problem. But sometimes we think the problem is, how do I get rid of the thought, as opposed to how do I change my relationship to the thought?
Yeah. So it's I hear now the connection with the mindfulness here. Yeah, and to maybe in some third wave language, like a diffusion, like that. We have to accept our thoughts, and also that the motivation is very important, just to experience that my behaviors, they may cause the problem, that they are not the solution of the problem.
Yeah. And I think one part of that sentence, I agree with it. We should accept our thoughts. But I think people with OCD sometimes don't like that sound. How can I accept the thought about hurting a loved one, or getting sick or dying or something like that? And I think it's important. Yes, we do have to accept our thoughts, because we're not really the author of the thoughts. They show up and we are, okay, there's that thought. We don't have to accept the conclusions that we arrive at because of those thoughts. We don't have to accept the beliefs that we have around those thoughts. We should challenge those and change those. But the initial word that pops in your head that we're calling a thought, yeah, okay, it's there. So not accepting it is not accepting reality. What do you do next? That's what really matters.
Right. So it's important to establish safe relationship with our patient. Yeah, and then how do you plan treatment with the patients? Yeah, what is there, for example, any kind of OCD that you prefer the RP more than mindfulness, or what would be next step after the establishing the relationship,
Sure,
therapeutic?
Sure. Yeah, I like that question. So I'll answer it in two parts. First, I often hear people say, do you do ERP or do you do mindfulness? Or I don't like to do mindfulness. I only want to do ERP. Or you see a therapist with the website, I do mindfulness or I do ERP. I think it's important to understand that mindfulness, this is going to sound like a radical statement, but I still think it's true. Mindfulness is all psychotherapy. All psychotherapy, every kind of psychotherapy comes back to this basic fundamental concept that if you can pay attention to the present moment the way it actually is, without judgment and without the intention of changing it, then you are going to suffer less. And the point of psychotherapy is to suffer less. And so whether we're talking about depression, trauma, urges to use substances, or any other problem, including OCD, we're all teaching mindfulness. We might not say we're teaching mindfulness. We might not meditate or talk about Buddhism or anything like that. But at the end of the day, we're all trying to help people learn how not to get lost in the stories in their head.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Not to get lost in the past or the future, but to actually show up and experience life the way it really is in the moment. And if it's unpleasant, to learn how to deal with the unpleasant things that happen in the moment. So to your specific question of do I think, does this person need ERP or mindfulness? I think about one, ERP is still mindfulness, right? People are doing exposure therapy. They're confronting their fears. I want them to be present with that. I want them to be aware, this is what that feels like. You see people do exposure therapy sometimes and they close their eyes and and they're white knuckling through it, right?
Yeah.
And they're just trying, anybody can barrel through something difficult, but then all they really learn from that is that it was difficult, which they already knew. What we want people to learn is, I can handle this, right? It's difficult. Openness, exactly. So I'm always asking people, hey, while we're doing the exposure, are you with this? Are you feeling this? Are you aware of what's going on in the body and what's going on in your mind? And sometimes people get very distressed. If they get too distressed, sometimes, right, they might dissociate or panic or become suicidal. So we want to actually bring that down a little bit so they can stay present. So it's even in ERP, we're saying, okay, can you be present while we confront this thought? Can you be present while what does it feel like to resist a ritual? What's that mean to resist a compulsion? How does that, can you be there? Because at the end of the day, we want your brain to be a witness to the fact that you had the thought or the feeling or the image, and you didn't do compulsions, right? And if it doesn't get to witness that, it doesn't get to learn anything. So if I were to say, okay, there's some difference between, you could just go to a therapist and practice mindfulness. What do you need ERP for? Or you could just do ERP, forget about that mindfulness stuff. If there's any real difference, it's really more in the intentions, right? So in mindfulness, things arise, and you try to practice equanimity. Okay, I'm here with that thing. And in ERP, we're saying, I'm not going to wait for it to arise. I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to look at this image. I'm going to touch this dirty thing, and then I'm going to practice mindfulness.
I understand that when we do ERP and the exposure, so it is important how we as a therapist behave, that we also it is good when we are focusing on here and now, what's happening, and allowing our patient to learn a new, maybe not ideas, but to be aware of what's happening. To be mindful. So that we don't have to do intentional of the calling it mindfulness, that we can do exposure and still be mindful of be here and now. Just what do you feel? What's happening? Just to be aware of what's happening.
Exactly. Yeah. And different personality types and different sensitivities and ways people show up in the world might influence how you talk about mindfulness, or whether you even use the word mindfulness. And also there is a distinction between external mindfulness and internal mindfulness. And sometimes that's important to think about with your individual patient. Somebody who really has not developed the skill to recognize and resist rumination as a compulsion probably shouldn't engage in a lot of internal mindfulness and won't benefit from a lot of internal mindfulness, closing your eyes, looking at what's going on in the body, right? That might be, a setup for doing more compulsions, and that they might do more external mindfulness, like notice what you can see, notice what you can feel on the outside of your body, notice the sounds in the room, right? These are all also happening alongside your unwanted thoughts and your anxiety and your other feelings. So that's another part of forming the relationship, is really trying to understand the patient as an individual and how their mind really works.
And is it depends also at the type of OCD, like, because you said that you have different types of OCD. So maybe what are like the well-known types of OCD and how it can influence the therapy?
Sure. So there's always some discussion of, do we really have subtypes of OCD, or is it all just the same thing? I think that, I think there are legitimate subtypes of OCD. They're not different diagnoses, but they have different impacts on people. And I think there's more for us to learn about why, this person has this kind of OCD and that person has this other kind of OCD. What makes somebody vulnerable to certain themes and makes them, while they both might have the same thoughts, and they both might have the same intrusive thoughts, but they have a stronger reaction to one than the other, and they're going to engage in more compulsions. So they never really developed the other one as an obsession. They go, "Meh, that's a weird thought. I don't have to worry about it. But this one I can't tolerate," right? And then the behaviors make that, come to life. The major themes we tend to see in OCD are concerns with contamination, and would be the first one. That's the most common one, and it's the one everybody thinks about when you think about characters on television washing their hands.
Yeah. There was a series about the detective that he.
That's right, Monk.
Monk. Yes.
Yeah. Even there, though, it's not as simple as it looks. Of course, they have to simplify things to tell a story on TV. But if we should really take a look at, well, what is contamination OCD? Oh, well, it's like a fear of germs. Sometimes, most of the time, I find it has very little to do with germs. So, for example, you might have a fear that if you become contaminated by germs, bodily fluids, chemicals, environmental contaminants, or really anything you see as being dirty or unclean, it might cause you to get sick and die. Okay, that's one fear. Another fear might be that if you don't handle that situation competently, you might spread it and cause somebody else to get sick and die, which would be a grave moral concern or a harm concern. Another issue might be that if you were to get sick, it might cause you to throw up, which would be like a fear of throwing up, which is another concern, or it might cause you to lose control in some way, which might be an existential concern, or you might have a particular disgust sensitivity to the idea of being contaminated or being contaminated by very specific things. And even in that, there might be subtypes. Like, if I allow myself to be disgusted, I'll panic and go insane. Or if I allow myself to be disgusted, I'll suffer forever. And so really understanding the person and their relationship to contamination, it really matters. And that's just one form of OCD, right?
We have many we could do the whole series of podcasts about the types of OCD and subtypes. And
exactly. So just to make sure I'm covering some of the major bases, some of the other very common forms of OCD are what we call harm OCD. So this fear of being responsible for causing harm to yourself or others, either because you imagine you might lose control and snap and hurt yourself or somebody else, or because you weren't vigilant enough and you didn't pay attention to something and you accidentally hurt yourself or someone else. Sexual obsessions are very common in OCD, and these would be unwanted intrusive thoughts about having attractions or predispositions to engage in sexual behavior that doesn't actually line up with your genuine desires and sense of identity and self. I think you mentioned earlier something, you said the word somatic.
Somatic, yeah.
Yeah, so that's another kind where people become very sort of obsessive about what's going on in their body, what does it mean, paying, kind of hyper aware, paying too much attention to things like blinking, breathing, swallowing, bladder fullness, even being hyper aware of your own thought process sometimes.
Yeah.
Heart rate is a common one. And you could see there's some crossover there also with health anxiety. What does this mean? Do I have a heart attack? Do I have cancer? Things like that.
Yeah. And the panic attack, then they can develop.
Yeah. And then we have, any kind of variety of obsessions. Anybody could really obsess about anything. I could kind of force it into a category, but sometimes people just have these miscellaneous obsessions, whether they're existential obsessions. I can't stop thinking about what happens after death. Of course, religious obsessions are very common. Moral obsessions, am I a good person? One way I find helpful to think about all of these things, if you're trying to put them all in one big box, is that they may have something to do with difficulty in the brain, part of the brain that says good enough, right? So, for example, if I shut my car door and I press the button and the car locks and I hear that click, and then my brain says, good enough, your car is locked, and I walk.
Yeah, you can go away.
Yeah, there's something that feels like good enough. And if I didn't have that feeling, even though I heard the click and I know I remember shutting the door, I still might not feel like it's locked, and I might feel like I have to go back and check again. And you could apply that to pretty much every form of OCD. I'm not clean enough. I'm not safe enough. The doors are not locked enough. I haven't checked enough times. Even I'm not a good enough person. It's kind of the same problem, right? At some point, people without OCD go, well, how good do I have to be? And they shrug and they move on with their life. But somebody with OCD really struggles with that idea.
So it's important to know, because I think that it could be easily misdiagnosed with some personality issues, because from the perspective of the diagnosis, it's like a personality, like being not sure who am I, but this is not about the personality, but it could be also the part of the OCD, or the like a subtype of the OCD, like don't feeling like I'm good enough, I knew myself good enough, and like to be like, I think that it could be also connected to like being sure or being not sure. Yeah,
exactly. So good enough, it's kind of similar language as certain enough or free of doubt. And I think especially with people who obsess about morality, and we have this subtype called moral scrupulosity. But again, even the person compulsively washing their hands is having a moral concern. Did I take good enough care of my health? Did I protect other people from COVID or whatever? So many of these obsessions have moral underpinnings. And just in the same way a person might have physical health anxiety, a fear of having a disease, a person could have mental health anxiety. And so what I see very common in people with moral scrupulosity is this fear of having personality disorders. Many people have personality disorders. It's not a death sentence. Personality disorders are treatable if you understand them. But just because you have a thought about some uncertainty about whether or not you did the right thing doesn't mean you have antisocial personality disorder, right? And a lot of people are afraid. Does this mean I'm a narcissist? Does this mean I'm a sociopath? Does this mean this? Does this mean that? And they start to research things, and they get very triggered because they see things in common with their experience.
Like a medicine student, then when you read about the disorder, so all disorders are about me.
Yeah, exactly. And so sometimes I find people, they become so afraid of letting themselves off the hook, of letting themselves be okay, because their mind is telling them they might have done terrible things. And to say, well, so what, and move on feels like something a crazy serial killer psychopath would say. And so they continue to ruminate and research it and try to figure it out. And the safest place they can get to is a place of self-hatred. And if you spend too long in self-hatred, you're going to develop some other problems, depression and a lack of sense of self and things like that. So I find it very interesting and also very sad when people have been stuck in this space for so long that they'd rather just get confirmation that they're bad people than like have to completely reinvent all of the work that they've done and understand, no, this is really just OCD and it's treatable and you need to kind of let it go, right? And that letting go process is very scary when you've invested a lot of time in not letting it go.
I'm wondering, like, after the OCD treatment, like, do we need to like go into some like work with the core beliefs, or like in the way of the more like traditional CBT work, or the schema therapy, or not? Like, or you think that there is no need, or is it depend on something? Like, do we need like do some, because there is a lot of theories like about the personality, the types of personality, and what's your like here experience about it?
My experience has evolved over the years, which is a good thing. And working in a residential environment where I'm, almost exclusively working with people whose symptoms are quite severe, I have found that definitely more often than not, after the OCD is resolved, there's other work to be done. And in mild or moderate OCD, it's not always the case. You knock out the OCD, you're better, you're good, you move on with your life. Maybe you still have some mild OCD symptoms, but you know how to manage them. But in the more high, moderate to severe cases, what seems to be quite common to me, and the way I tend to think about it is, there's the soil, and then there's what's growing out of the soil. And what we see is what's growing out of the soil. What we understand, I don't like that, those ugly mushrooms growing out of the soil, let's cut them off, right? And so these people have gone in and out of outpatient OCD treatment if they're lucky enough to even have that accurate diagnosis. And they do benefit from the treatment. Sometimes they kind of cut off those mushrooms and they go back to their life, but then the mushrooms grow back. And why is that? Well, for some people, for example, with trauma-based conditions, the OCD is serving a function, right? The OCD is actually making them feel more certain, or giving them the illusion of being protected from the trauma. And so you can see the trauma here and the OCD is around here kind of protecting you from it. And then they meet a guy like me and I get the OCD out of the way. And then suddenly they realize everything is much worse. Yes, they're not doing compulsions, but now they're face to face with things that happen to them that their brain has not figured out what to do with, because they were such extreme violations of otherwise reasonable expectations. Somebody who's supposed to love me has hurt me. And the brain's like, I can't handle that, puts it away, covers it in OCD. As long as I get everything perfectly organized and just right. That's another form of OCD I failed to mention before, is the just right OCD. So then we teach people, okay, be more flexible. You don't need to be protected so much. And then they're like, I don't like it. And they go back to their compulsion
behaviors. Yeah.
Feel safer. Yeah. So, not everybody with OCD has trauma. Not everybody with OCD has some other deep, complicated problem. And OCD itself, and I've heard it spoken about this way, and so I make sure to mention this, OCD is not a surface problem. It's not some easy thing like, okay, once we deal with surface stuff, we can do the deep. All of these conditions are in relation to each other and inform each other. The way I think about mental health is not, oh, you have this long list of diagnoses, you're really messed up. It's no, each diagnosis is a star, and the star forms a constellation, and your mental health is the shape of that constellation.
Yeah, so it's like the process-based CBT that Hayes and Professor Hoffman, I just also read a book about the dynamic net of like problems that they influence, they reinforce each other. And that we have to like figure out which of those they are moderators and which of others they influence other. And that's it's
Stephen Hayes, Stephen Hoffman, brilliant people. They should know. Yeah. So, to your question, I find that for a lot of people, it's of great benefit after you get a handle on your OCD, and the OCD is not, taking all of your attention. If you want to really keep the OCD in its place, you want to address the things that might cause your brain to invite the OCD back for protection. And that could be any number of types of treatments, so whether it's ACT or a psychodynamic therapy or some other kind of treatment. Could be a number of different things.
Okay. And did you find out that there are some, like the most challenging, I don't know, is it good to use that word, but the types of OCD, like for me personally, the most challenging patients, they were with religious obsessions and compulsions. So because then we are going into, on the one hand, we have like the symptoms, and the other hand, that someone, they have their beliefs, their values, and this is, I know that we don't shoot to, again, as the patient, they are going into like ruminate, think about the religious thing, but sometimes it is difficult not to do it, like not to go into. And maybe, how do you have some, on the one hand, the types of, OCD that, or maybe not types, but some difficulties that we should pay attention more, and and how do you deal with religious obsessions and compulsions?
I don't think that, from my point of view, there isn't a particular theme that's harder than another one. I think, I don't think it's unreasonable as a clinician to feel that way, and it probably says about something about the individual clinician and their experience, working with different people. I think that, from my perspective, what makes things more difficult isn't necessarily the theme, but how the theme connects to that person could make it harder to treat. So, for example, people with the sensory motor, somatic obsessions, in my experience, tend to also be severely depressed. And the depression is part of what's causing them to have all these somatic experiences. And then the OCD is obsessing about them. And I'm trying to treat the OCD, but the depression is fighting against me the whole way. And it's very difficult, right? So similarly, in religious scrupulosity, you might have somebody raised in an environment where they're told, hey, these are the rules of how to live, and you better get them right or else. And they're doing too much of it. And you're saying, hey, you need to be more flexible. And they're saying, well, God says this and God says that. The complication there isn't that it's religious scrupulosity. The complication there is probably their family system. They were raised in an environment where they were discouraged from having any flexibility in their thinking. And there are certainly other people who practice their religion, right? If we're talking about one of the larger religions where there are millions and millions of people who don't seem to have this same problem. So what's going on there, right? So I always try to find out from that person, first of all, what do you really believe? And then what have you been told? And where's the disconnect? And how do we find that space where you can get what you want? There's a general rule, there's a general principle here. The worse your OCD, the more compulsive you are, the more your fears will come true. Not exactly the way you think, but in some different way. So, for example, a person with religious scrupulosity is afraid that they'll be disconnected from God because they're not going to be doing the things that their God tells them they're supposed to do. But what does the person with religious scrupulosity end up doing? Avoiding going to their place of worship because it's too triggering, praying in a way that's repetitive and rote and not really having any intention in it, obsessing about themselves and not thinking about others, right? All of the things that their religion teaches them not to do, right? They end up practicing their religion poorly in an attempt to practice their religion perfectly. What happens when you wash your hands too much? You scrub off the protective oils on your skin dries, cracks, bleeds, gets infected. What were you trying to do? You were trying to not get infected, right?
Yeah, it's a great
So I
point of
think you
view.
could map that onto pretty much any theme, and it's like the more you buy into the OCD is like it's like a little character, it's sort of evil genie. It's sort of tricking you into asking for something you don't really want.
Right. Yeah, it's a great metaphor. Yeah, that we can change the perspective of the disorder, like change the perspective that the OCD is something outside of you, that is something telling to you, that then we can change the relationship. Yeah, it's great. Working with patient, do you work like we have in some protocols that there is like a 20 sessions or something, or you are also more flexible here, like that you are measuring maybe some behavioral changes, or like how do you work?
It's a good question. I struggle with this. I think an argument could be made that OCD treatment should be very structured, protocol oriented, time limited, right? And because
not flexible.
Yeah, right. So I always struggle with this. People call and they say, well, how long is it going to take? Well, the research shows CBT takes 3 months, blah blah blah. But everybody's different. And so I find it very difficult sometimes, because as I'm working with somebody and I'm like, okay, we're making this progress, and there's an order to it. We start with psychoeducation, and we go into cognitive therapy, and we learn how to challenge distorted cognitive distortions, and then we build an ERP hierarchy, and we start working on the hierarchy, and then we kind of forget about it all and just do therapy, and it's like mostly exposure therapy, but again, some ACT and some DBT and some RO-DBT, and just, okay, we're trying to get this person to learn how to take care of themselves. The reason why OCD therapy is generally considered short is that we don't want the person to become dependent on the therapist. We want the person to really understand, I now know how to take care of myself. And so we emphasize, this is going to end. This relationship is going to end. This is not psychoanalytic work where it's intentionally, long term. This is, I'm teaching you something. You're going to take what you've learned, and you are going to be the therapist for yourself.
Yeah, right.
As I get older and as I work with more complex cases, I find that this is a little bit of a fantasy, but for some people, it's what they need. So I follow a structure up to a point, and then it's about, okay, where do we go next? And sometimes the next step in the treatment, the final step on the exposure hierarchy, is goodbye. It's okay. And in other cases, it's okay. Now you have this under control. We're going to be in maintenance mode, and while we're in maintenance mode, you're going to get that trauma work or other kind of work done, and if things get riled up again, we're going to go right back into the work.
Yeah. So like mostly we are shaping the process, and we want to use all of those evidence-based approaches to respond well on your client's needs. So that's the things that you said on the beginning of our podcast, that we want to follow the patient and to respond on their inflexibility in most appropriate way to how we can deal with those kinds of problems. Yeah. And if someone has a trauma, do you often start work with the trauma work when sometimes when for example, the symptoms of OCD, that they are connected with trauma? Do you do, for example, the prolonged exposure or some other trauma treatments, or you are focusing on OCD?
Yeah. At the retreat, because we really are using an individualized approach, different types of trauma and different types of people, need different approaches. More often than not, we use something called cognitive processing therapy here for
CBT,
trauma, which is and it's such a close cousin to OCD work. If you think about cognitive behavioral therapy for OCD, we have the beliefs that are leading you to the conclusion that you must do your compulsions, right? Compulsion, in the English language comes from the word compel. You're compelled to do it. You don't want to do it, but you have to. And so well, how did you form that conclusion? It's always fascinating to me when you explain OCD in the first session and everybody agrees, okay, the problem is these compulsions are reinforcing my obsessions. Why don't you just stop, right? Well, you don't stop because in the moment that you get triggered, you believe something, you're thinking something that's leading you to this conclusion that you have to do these compulsions. So can we break down some of those beliefs? Now that's for OCD, that's the C of CBT, and then ERP is the B, obviously. But if we're talking about trauma and not just OCD, so there's other parts of that C that need to be addressed. There's beliefs that you developed because of the trauma that are both inviting the OCD to, kind of protect you, but are also keeping you from being able to
touch,
to really kind of like live in the present moment. Those beliefs that came from the trauma are, could have been 10, 20, 30 years ago, are showing up now in this interaction, right? And so can you catch that and notice that and challenge that in that moment? But you mentioned prolonged exposure. That's another good treatment for PTSD. I'm not very well versed in some of the other treatments, but internal family systems is another approach that people use. So here we try to use a holistic approach. So because of that constellation, if we just treat the OCD, the trauma takes center stage. If we just treat the trauma, the OCD gets in the way. And I've seen this in real time when I'm sharing a case of a person who has OCD and trauma, and I'm their OCD therapist, and the person over there is the trauma therapist. They go to the trauma therapist and they say, I can't do trauma therapy right now because I have to do these compulsions and there's too much OCD. And then they come to me, the OCD therapist, and all they want to talk about is their trauma. And they don't want to talk about their OCD. So we have to work as a team. I think there are some people that can do this step-by-step model. I do the trauma therapy, then I do the OCD therapy, and I do the depression therapy, then I do the addiction therapy. But in this setting, we try to all work together as we're a new family system for them, and we're sort of working on all of the stars in the constellation at once.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I think that we have lot of knowledge from you about the OCD and the treatment, and I know that you have a patient soon, so maybe it would be good to have like a little break before it. So
it's very thoughtful of you. My patients never think about that. 59 minutes in, they have one more question.
yeah. Maybe I'll assume our today session. Yeah, but it was a great honor to have you here with me and to have you on my podcast. And maybe on the saying goodbye, maybe what would be the one advice to the therapist of OCD? Like, would you very shortly say at the end of our podcast?
Advice to a therapist treating OCD?
Yeah. Like the one shot, the best one,
Yeah. There's so many things I could say. The thing that's coming up for me now is, I don't even know how a person could follow these instructions, but what's coming up for me is be passionate about this work. Really treat the treatment of OCD with enthusiasm, like you're excited to do it, like it really matters, like you're going to really reduce someone's suffering and make the world a better place because they're going to be out there suffering less. Don't just follow some manual. Don't just go through the motions. Really connect. Really remember this is psychotherapy and evidence-based and protocol-based, and we know what works and what doesn't work. But really, really, like, if you notice that you're maybe not caring so much and you're just kind of doing it because it's your job, that's not a crime. There are probably lots of settings where you're still making the world a better place, but I'm protective of the OCD community. So like, if you really want to be an OCD specialist, really see if you can access that passion. It makes a difference for the patients, I think.
Right. Thank you very much, John. I'll post a link to the book to also because in Poland we have also the second version of it. So everyone who's interested in, it would be available for everyone.
Wonderful. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Much.
What a privilege.
It was an honor.